For the next part of this video, I'll be going over another example of an affirmative case and give you guys some advice on how to write your affirmative cases in our upcoming meetings. Remember that this case is made for a league tournament setting, a state and league setting, rather than a national setting, which means that the justifications for the framework will be a lot less thorough. But once again, we start off with a similar explanation of what the resolution is. We give a poignant and powerful statement to introduce the affirmative story. Because predictive policing makes everyone guilty until proven innocent, I affirm the resolution. A crucial difference here is that we're not using a quotation to introduce the resolution, which is perfectly fine. Just in this case, make sure that your explanation or introduction is really concrete, poignant, and rhetorically powerful. And that's what I do by referencing a common idiom, which is guilty until proven innocent. Try to do something similar if you're going to introduce the resolution that way in your affirmative case. As we have already discussed, what comes right after the resolution is our definition section. Just because this resolution is a lot shorter than the other one I just showed you, predictive policing is really the only thing we need to define. So I read a piece of evidence from the National Institute of Justice. Don't be afraid to have a really short definition section if your resolution is as short as this one. But for the lethal autonomous weapons topic, that might be a little bit different depending on your research on the topic. Next, we go on to our value. Remember, in this case, we really only need a 1 to 2 sentence explanation of both the value and the value criterion. So I just explained that justice is our value because the resolution is talking about a moral obligation. And because just governments have to maximize social welfare, then clearly that's our value criterion. If someone presses you on this, then just make sure that you're ready to give a more thorough explanation in cross-ex or the 1AR. But as it stands, when you're writing your affirmative case for a CFL tournament, you don't need to go all out on having a really long framework section. Instead, we can spend that extra time writing some really thorough and powerful contentions. So the first contention, predictive policing is inherently biased. As you'll see throughout this case, bias is really the main point of this case. I start off by reading a lot of statistics and examples. Remember, that's crucial to making your case seem really credible and argumentatively powerful. If you just stand up in cross-ex and your opponent asks you, well, where has this been done before? And you don't have an answer, well, that's not very good. Your ethos is going to get destroyed and your case is standing on pretty thin ice. What you want to do is you want to have some examples in each of your contentions and some statistics, as proven right here by the evidence from Dr. Richardson. This evidence is a great example of how you can creatively use evidence. This isn't just an article that I cut last year for the March-April topic, but rather it's a huge chart that this doctor of law, I believe, from NYU compiled of all these examples where predictive policing led to really racially biased actions. You don't need to have a big paragraph and then highlight it like you would for a normal card to have good evidence. You can creatively repurpose that. It's like how I inserted figures in my nationals case. This time, all I'm doing is I have the chart that Dr. Richardson used in her evidence, and I'm basically citing that. Don't be afraid to have brackets in your evidence too. It's a pretty common practice in LD to add bracketed words to make sure that your evidence makes more sense just as you're reading it, but tread with caution. You better not ever misrepresent your evidence by having bracketed text that changes the meaning of what you're saying. For example, maybe I could have changed this Boston example from being 2002 to 2010. That is incredibly abusive, and there will be severe repercussions if you ever do that. That is an evidence ethics violation. You'll probably be disqualified from the tournament. Me, Mr. D, and a show will probably take pretty drastic actions if you are ever caught cheating in any tournament for Lincoln Douglas debate. So please tread with caution when you're adding words to paraphrase your evidence. This is not public forum where you're able to just blindly paraphrase stuff. You have to be reading the evidence, and you should only be supplementing it with little words like this when you have like a chart like this. where it would be really hard for me just to list off all this stuff, and it would be pretty disengaging for the judge. Adding a from before all these dates doesn't change the meaning of this at all. All it does is just makes my reading it sound a little better, which is perfectly acceptable. Just remember that you cannot change the content of your evidence, just that there are slight changes to make it sound more cohesive when you're reading it off during your speech. Now, I explain what this evidence means. I use a lot of analogies. The color of one's skin dictating their odds of going to jail. It means being locked up based on the poverty line. These are really powerful rhetorical devices that you should be setting up in your affirmative. Your app is your home base. It's what you're going to be leveraging against every single argument your opponent is making, and you want to set up a powerful story that you can reference in the 2AR. If you're just throwing new analogies out the window in your last speech, that's just going to sound like it came out of left field if you don't reference it in your 1AC, if you don't reference it in your 1AR, which means that you're going to want to set up your most potent and rhetorically powerful images in the affirmative so that you have a really good toolbox of using all these metaphors and analogies towards the end of the debate, so you seem like you had this plan from the beginning. And that is an incredibly persuasive ethos to give off to the judge, and something that I want all of you to keep in mind when writing your affirmative. Set up the best 2AR possible. Set up those metaphors that are really going to stick in your judge's mind, and use them to explain your evidence, and use them to make your story seem incredibly persuasive. And that's what I'm doing after this Richardson evidence. Now, I lead into this evidence from the LA Times, which is similar to the Shelton evidence from my Nationals affirmative. It doesn't use a lot of jargon, but it talks in a language that anyone could basically understand, which is excellent. It means that you don't need to spend as much time explaining it because the judge probably understands it already when you're reading it. So instead of just re-explaining the card like I did for my really jargony Rashid Richardson evidence, all I need to do now is just tie this back into the value criterion and summarize the contention. Remember, after your contentions, you want to have just a quick summary of what the thesis was and how that ties into the criterion and the value. And this is what I'm doing right here. I have this 2-sentence little blip where I say that feeding predictive policing bad data leads to racist outcomes. And that creates over policing, a cycle of inequality, which is obviously terrible for society. Remember that you don't need to just name drop value criterion at the end of your contention, especially in a league setting where judges are more ambivalent towards the criterion. But remember, it should be something that you're referencing, because if your opponent just catches you by asking you in cross-ex that you don't really have any ties to the criterion, now that is a terrible look for you. So we're just preparing for an instance like that. Also, it's a good way just to frame your case. If you have like a central couple arguments that are tied by a single value, well, that just makes your story seem a lot more cohesive and persuasive to the judge. So even if the value criterion isn't really debated really thoroughly in your debate, it's still an important tool that helps you frame how all your arguments matter and why that means you should vote affirmative or negative. So that's something that you should keep in mind at the end of your contentions. Now we lead to the second contention, which is similar to the Asian Growth Research Institute evidence insofar as it is somewhat preemptive. The two major arguments that the negative used to go for on this topic is just that predictive policing is really good at breaking down crime, and predictive policing isn't really that biased. Well, the affirmative basically preempts that efficacy argument that predictive policing puts more criminals in jail by saying that no, predictive policing is terrible for making our streets safer. And that's what a strong contention can do. It serves its own purpose. It stands on its own 2 feet. Because if I prove that predictive policing is bad at stopping crime, well, that fulfills the criterion. It shows that predictive policing doesn't maximize societal welfare. It's a pretty bad idea. But it also preempts the negative's core argument about efficacy by essentially just disproving it through 3 minutes of your AF. And remember, the importance of having preemptive arguments is that it allows you to have a much easier time in the 1AR, because the hardest speech in LD is definitely the 1AR, because you have 4 minutes to answer your opponent's case and defend your own, and they have 7 minutes to do so. So when you're writing your case, you should think about the 1AR and the 2AR in mind. You should think, how am I going to make a strong 2AR? How am I going to make a strong 1AR? And a good way that we can do that in the affirmative case is by having some preemptive arguments, some contentions that stand on their own, but also break down the negative so that you don't need to spend a ton of time reading this puente evidence in the 1AR or spend a ton of time in the 2AR reiterating your argument because you never really had the time to explain it. If you get the ball rolling earlier in the debate, that sets you up for success later. So you want to think long-term strategy when you're writing your affirmative. And I know this is an advanced topic, which I will definitely explain more in the advanced casing lecture, but I want you guys all just to keep that in mind when writing your first drafts of your cases. Because even if your preemptive argument doesn't have like the best evidence or isn't the best thing that you've ever written on any of these topics, that's fine. It's all just about making sure that we start the learning process early so that by the major tournaments like state quals, nat quals, state nats, we are much better poised to do a lot better at those tournaments. And the way we do that is by getting tons of feedback early on. So after this evidence, I do the good old thing where I explain all the examples. I make it seem like the affirmative case has a copious amount of evidentiary backing. I just list a ton of cities where predictive policing has failed, which is a great way to make it seem like you have the most thorough evidence on the topic. If you can just give a list of 6, 7, 8 examples in one piece of evidence, wow, you look like you are in control of the topic. And that's something excellent to keep in mind when you're writing your affirmative. With the lethal autonomous weapons topic, why don't you talk about several examples where lethal autonomous weapons were terrible? There's several wars, decades of history. Those are all things that you can reference in your affirmative case, which makes your app incredibly persuasive and credible. Something that we should all keep in mind when writing our cases in the future. Finally, I read this evidence from Mr. Ferguson. He just talks about how predictive policing is pretty bad and makes people guilty until proven innocent. This is referencing the first line that I used to start opening the affirmative. You want to make sure that your opening line is backed throughout your case. If I just said guilty until proven innocent at the beginning of this app, but never actually talked about making people guilty until proven innocent in my contentions, that just looks bad. It makes it seem like you don't have the evidentiary backing to prove your story. So you look like you're not credible on this issue, which is something you do not want to happen in your 1AC. So that's why this piece of Ferguson evidence exists in this case. It has some strong rhetoric, analogies, and really poignant images to try to prove that this promise that I made at the beginning of my speech, that predictive policing makes people guilty until proven innocent, is true. You want to be backing up your claims, even when they're started a long time ago in the speech. You want to have the evidentiary backing to build your credibility. And if you have any claims that you've made in your case that just don't go unwarranted, then you're going to have a bad time in later speeches, because a good debater will capitalize on that. And then your debating, your round might end up in a way that you don't really want it to end up as. So now we just have a quick transition to a couple more pieces of evidence at the end of this contention, just tying back into the beginning of the speech, which is guilty until proven innocent, and then another preemptive argument about bad data, because a major negative argument was just that, well, the data can be changed. But the Rashida Richardson evidence just says that would be nearly impossible to do because there's 30, 40, 50 years of police data. That's very biased racially, and that would be almost impossible to get over. So the Rashida Richardson evidence once again serves as a preemptive argument, which is an excellent strategic tool, but it also stands on its own. Even if they don't make the data argument, the affirmative in the 1AR can just easily make the argument that clearly predictive policing is bad because it perpetuates inequality and is built off biased data. That's a pretty intuitive argument that you can make even if your opponent doesn't make it for you. Thus, this is what a strong second contention can be. It can be preemptive. It destroys the negative before they even have a chance to speak. It can also be powerful in terms of your story. It's referencing the guilty until proven innocent argument, and thus proves the resolution true or false, which is your obligation in the debate. So I summarized the contention one more time, read a couple examples, and talk about artificially low crime statistics. I try to put the judge in the position of one of those police officers. This is a great way to add concrete imagery to your contention. Ask the judge to be put in that situation. You make a comparison between people who are working and people who are trying to fulfill their quotas as police. That makes the judge listen. If you're directly talking to them by saying, hey, you, this is something that you probably do, when the police do it, that's terrible. If you're able to reference them like that, that's a great way to get your judge listening, to make your affirmative persuasive, which is a great way so that your affirmative cases are concrete and powerful in their strategic purposes. Finally, I write a quick conclusion, just summarizing the guilty until proven innocent story. Then I explain that with a quick idiom and metaphor. And finally, I just summarize the contentions one last time in this last sentence. So, after going over these two cases, I know that I've been talking for a long time in this video, and I appreciate you guys listening to it. This is crucial advice that I hope will help you guys develop into really strong and successful LD debaters. And having some good examples of what a good case looks like is a great way to start on the right foot as being a strong affirmative debater in LD. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know during our meetings. I hope that you took away some great advice from listening to these, and I seriously look forward to seeing the work that you guys can produce in our upcoming meetings. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys all have a great day.